Welcome back. In this video we're going to add some very basic shaders to our objects. So if you've been working along with me in the last video and you've added some very simple primitives and made your own simple model, it might be similar to mine, it might be something of your own. You can just continue to work along with whichever model you want, or you can download the train.blend file and work along with this model. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to just clean up this model just a little bit. Now when we work with shaders, one of the things that shaders do is it gives characteristics to the surfaces of our objects. Now at the moment you can see with this basic grey material we're getting all these facets on our objects. This isn't so much to do with the shader that's on these objects, but with the actual surface normals on our objects. So we can clean this faceting up very simply by just selecting everything and hitting Shade Auto Smooth. Now in this case what it's going to do is it's going to recognise all these curved surfaces should be smooth and all these angled surfaces should be flat, and that's going to work most of the time, 99% of the time that's going to work just fine. So with that set up, now what we want to do is we want to add some very simple materials to our objects. But at the moment we are in a solid view, so what we want to do is we want to get out of that solid view, and we also want to be able to see our node editor. So I'm going to go to our procedural shading editor. Let's go to this vertical one. So we have our node editor right here and we have our 3D view here. We can close this down just a little bit to make a little bit more space and zoom in on our train. Now as I mentioned, we are in solid mode here. So what does that mean? That means that we are not seeing the actual materials on our objects. We're just seeing a representation, sometimes of colour, sometimes of texture that might be on our objects, but we won't see reflections, we won't see refractions, we won't see any procedural textures, image-based textures, anything like that that we apply to our objects. What we want to do is we want to change one of these different shading modes. So let's just quickly go through those. We have wireframe, in which case we don't see any shader at all we see is the edges of our objects. We have solid mode, which we were just in. We do have some interesting options we can use in solid mode, and maybe we'll dive into that a little bit later, but at the moment we want to use either material preview mode or rendered mode. Now material preview mode is going to use the material preview settings which are found in this drop down box. We have the option to choose either scene lights or world lights, and scene world, in which case at the moment we just have a grey background, or we actually have this HDRI image that we can use, and we can turn on this opacity. You can see it doesn't change the shading on our object, but we do get to see it in the background, so we can see some context for our lighting. We can also blur that if we want. So sometimes I quite like to put quite a heavy blur on this and just have the opacity up about halfway. We can make it a little bit stronger by turning up the strength or turning it all the way down. The default of 1 is usually fine for most of these HDRIs. We can change that HDRI as well, depending on what you want to do. So this one for an interior, which I think will suit a toy quite well. So now that we have our lighting set up, let's also just quickly look at rendered mode. So in rendered mode, we don't have any options here. We have our background, which is grey, and we have one point light in our scene. We can change this from scene lights and world scene. We can turn that back. So at the moment in rendered mode, this should look exactly the same as material preview mode. They're both using Eevee at the moment. But if we go into rendered mode and then we change our renderer and we change that over from Eevee to Cycles. So now what we'll have is we'll have a Cycles preview in render mode and an Eevee preview in the material preview mode. You can see Cycles takes a lot longer to render there. You can see our samples ticking up quite slowly. We can also change a couple of settings over here. We can change our device from CPU to GPU, and once we do that you can see our samples barely appear on the screen, it just renders so fast. We can also turn on denoising, You have two options for that. You have optics or open image. I'm just going to keep it on automatic for the moment. And I'm also going to change passes from albedo to albedo and normal. And you can see these both look pretty similar. Cycles looks a lot smoother. We have some bounce light there that's a little bit hard to see maybe, and some ambient occlusion. But we're getting pretty much the same shader on the object. So let's actually add some real shaders to these objects. So in order to add a shader to an object, we have to select the object. And in the node editor, just hit the new button. And by default, we're going to get this principled BSDF node. Now, I'm going to go through a lot of these different settings in the next section. But for the moment, what I want you to do is take up this challenge. So your challenge for this video is to choose a shader mode, and that can be either the Eevee material preview or the Cycles render view, or even the Eevee render view if you want. Make sure you have your CPU or GPU set up correctly for that. Make sure that you turn off Scene World so you can light your scene with one of the default HDRIs. This is really important if you're using Cycles render view, and that way you can avoid having to set up any additional lighting and you can just get straight on to creating those shaders. Now create some very simple shaders for your models. So have a little go at adding some materials to your objects, pause the video for a while and work on that, and when we come back I'm going to show you just a few simple materials that I'm going to add to this object. Okay, so we've got a base material added to this object, and I want to make this metal, so I'm going to turn the metallic value all the way up, and I want to make it a little bit more reflective, so I'm going to turn roughness down, and we start to get this nice metal look here. I'm going to add a similar material to the end. In fact, let's just add the same material, so I'm going to click on that. Instead of hitting new, I'm going to go to this drop down box. I'm just going to add this material back on there. Now you can see at the moment I haven't done a very good job of naming these materials. This is called material 001. So let's change that over. Let's just call this shiny metal. And I think that looks okay. Let's make this material a new material, and let's just call this red plastic. So it's going to be a really simple red plastic material. So I'm just going to make it red. Now, it's plastic, it's not metal, so we're not going to turn metallic on. We're going to keep that all the way down. And we want it to be a bit more shiny. So let's decrease the roughness a little bit. Maybe something like that. Okay, so the wheels, let's see, what colour do we want the wheels? Let's make them black. So let's just call this black wheels. We'll change our base colour to black. So we're not going to make it 100% black. We're going to take that off just a little bit, make it a slightly lighter. Nothing in reality is 100% black, or almost nothing. So we are going to turn the roughness up a little bit as well. Not all the way, maybe about 0.85, 0.84, thereabouts. Now I want to add that same material to these other objects, and I want to do it all at the same time. So let's click on each of these objects. We're going to hold shift, click on all of them, rotate around, shift and click, and then we're going to click on the object that we have the material that we like already attached finally. And you can see that's highlighted with a kind of light orange line around them, whereas the rest are a bit darker. We can now go to our object menu, go down to link and link materials, and that will apply that same material to all these other objects. Now let's do one final material for the base here. Let's see, we have metal, we have black, we have red. Let's see, let's go with something that kind of contrasts with red. Let's go for this kind of blue. It's on the opposite side of the colour wheel, so we know that it kind of contrasts with it, but at the same time it also complements it in a way. We're going to decrease the roughness a little bit. We don't want to make it metal. I don't think there's anything else we want to change on that really. So this is going to be our very simple object. I'm just going to click off of these two buttons here to get rid of all the gizmos and stuff on the screen. And this is basically our very simple, very simple, I should say, shaded little object, your very first shaders. In the next section, we're going to get into what all these different coloured dots are and what they do, what we can plug into those. We're going to go through a whole bunch of all these different options that we see in our add menu. But before we move on to the next section, we just have one more thing to do, and that is to enable the Node Wrangler add-on. So join me in the next video and I'll show you what that add-on is all about.